Hey, thanks for watching this video. Before we begin today's discussion, I would like to bring something very necessary to your ear. Right now, the House is trying to implement a bill that would cause for a presidential administration to willfully label something an organization that donates or supports terrorist activity. It's U.S. Bill 9495. It's currently in the House. Please, the first link in the description, as it always is to a webpage for the United States Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Within this webpage, you can do a lot of things, but the one I am asking you to do requires no money and very little of your time. Please go to the Take Action section of this website. Drop down, have them generate a letter for you to send to your representatives. If you don't want that, if you'd rather make it more personal, that's great too. But please tell your representatives to block this bill. The incoming administration is not going to do anything to de-escalate tensions in the Middle East, no matter what promises have been told. And the current administration is not going to do anything for the rest of their term because they don't have to anymore. Not that they did a lot anyway. So please, just contact your representatives and tell them that this bill needs to be stopped. While you're there, feel free to donate. I donate every month. I've mentioned the number before. It's $10, not very much. Okay, enjoy the rest of this video. Now, with that being said, this video is going to talk about a subject that I like to talk about a lot. The United States presidents in a whole are all just manufacturers of the elite interest, as is most of the government. This has been seen time and time again. This is also a great video for an example of anyone who has ever said something like, the United States would never do anything bad foreign policy-wise, and they would never let their allies violate human rights. Here's an entire video in which we are going to discuss the only president in the history of the United States who was condemned and found guilty by the United Nations International Court of Justice. We'll get into that a little bit. We're going to be discussing Ronald Wilson Reagan. Spell out that name for me real fast. What number does every single name add up to? Check that out. Get back to me. It's a little fun conspiracy theory bit for you. Now, Ronald Wilson, Whit Reagan, good old Ronnie, and Nancy in office did a lot of things, both foreign policy-wise and domestically. We're going to talk about domestic first. We're going to talk about his administration's viewpoint on spending. We're going to talk a lot about the radicalization of the American right, as we had in my policy landscape video. And then we're going to talk about foreign policy, which is, quite frankly, one of the most terrifying and brutal examples of what happens when certain people with certain mindsets are in office and are in control. Now, domestically, Ronald Reagan's administration truly figured this out, that if you spend and spend and spend and create a deficit that is greater than anything the nation has ever seen, that will be the foundation for blocking any sort of progressive legislation. The Reagan administration gutted all sorts of social reform, all of the mental health asylums. Reagan gutted that, took away anything that could go for that, while spending increasingly on military and enhancing the richest of the rich. By that I mean the Reagan administration saw the first part in a long-standing 80s to now class warfare in which the majority of the wealth in the United States has gone from the lower and middle classes to the very top. Not the top 10%, the top 1%. Even honestly, if you analyze it more than that, under that as well. This all started with the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration boasts that it had a booming economy. The booming economy method of diversion has long been used because a booming economy means nothing for the middle and lower classes. It hasn't for quite some time. In fact, the American South saw record numbers of unemployment and record numbers of poverty shoot up. The Reagan administration did a few other things domestically that are pretty famous. They amplified the war on drugs that started with Nixon. In 1986, the Reagan administration implemented a bill proudly in which crack, rock, cocaine, if you had 10 grams of it, it was a mandatory 10 to 15 years, sometimes more than that. And powder cocaine, famously, if you had, 300 grams of it, that would mean you got some sort of sentence next to that. This is very famous because it is very clearly racially discriminating within the law itself. African Americans are more likely to be found with crack rock cocaine, and upper class white Americans are typically found with powder cocaine. The war on drugs was never about actually stopping people from doing drugs. It was about the same thing everything else has been since then. Hammering down on lower income poor people and putting them into the prison system, which, thanks to Ronald Reagan, has now become privatized. The privatized prison became a ample state of the Reagan administration. It grew over the 8 years he was in office. And if you know anything about how the 13th Amendment was written, you know that people who are incarcerated are eligible for slavery. There's a really good, documentary out there with the same name. Some people out there are probably listening to this waiting for me to talk about how the Reagan administration brought drugs into the American ghettos and the poorest neighborhoods to disenfranchise them and destabilize them. We're going to talk about that within the foreign policy because that's really where that is. And also, I would just like to say a lot of the ideas behind that, while there is some evidence for it that we can talk about, and I'll address all this in a minute, do kind of hit that conspiracy theory ideology. The Reagan administration did a lot of terrible, horrible things domestically that we can discuss in a moment. I mentioned it in the political landscape video, but Reagan radicalized the far right and really got evangelicals behind him by pretending to be against abortion. Once again, pretending. Look at his time as governor of California. He lied to Americans on normal occasions, and which is normal, don't get me wrong, but it is rare for us to be able to definitively say Ronald Reagan lied about all of these different issues. And yeah, so just to recap domestically, Reagan increased the deficit to stop any progressive reform and gave the top 1% a tax cut that has not stopped happening with Republican or Democrats in office. And this also includes raising taxes on the middle and lower classes. The middle class specifically pays way more in taxes than the rich elite do. And this is something that Reagan championed. The Reagan administration is often praised as a working class hero. He's considered the Republican Jesus, and you can see why in certain aspects. He definitely did a lot of things that people can be like, wow, yeah, he deregulated the economy. But he didn't really deregulate the economy in the way that people who talk about free state capitalism talk about it. The only thing Reagan did was he took an already pro-business government and he just increased it by 100%. The Reagan administration has overseen an increase in homelessness, increase in infant mortality, all sorts of terrible things domestically that we are never going to recover from, more than likely. As you know, I get a lot of my ideas and talking points through reading other people's work. If you would like to be more informed on Reagan's policies economically, Noam Chomsky has talked a lot about it. Richard Wolff has talked a lot about it. A few others. You go down that rabbit hole, you'll find a lot more that will allow you to be more informed than what I am able to say. Admittedly, domestically, when it comes to Reagan, I don't know a whole lot. But what I do know comes mostly in foreign policy. which we're now going to discuss. The Reagan administration is the only administration to ever be condemned by the International Court of Justice, the United Nations High Court, for what they said was acts of terrorism and unwarranted aggression in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, the Reagan administration oversaw the attempted overthrowing of the Sandinistas through their proxy military organization, the Contras. The Sandinistas were doing something that is unimaginable and unspeakable terror that I'm scared to even say it out loud. They were attempting to have their own democratic government, something that is just, you can't do that if you're this close to the United States. While the Sandinistas were attempting to have their own democratic government and the Reagan administration was attempting to overthrow them through Contras and military force, something that has been seen in United States history for forever, its close neighbors, Guatemala and El Salvador, were totally backed by the Reagan administration and other administrations too. The Carter administration backed them as well. But El Salvador and Guatemala had brutal regimes that insisted upon killing their own civilians. Anyone who spoke out against anything, there's a very famous case of this, of Oscar Romero in El Salvador, and in there as well, there were United Nations workers, 5 United Nations workers who were murdered. In Guatemala, 48 journalists were murdered between 1978 and 1985, and so on and so forth, all with the backing and weapons support from the United States government, primarily the Reagan administration. Total unfiltered violence against people who wanted to have democracy within their own country, and the Reagan administration willfully enforced murdering innocent people who just wanted to peacefully protest. In El Salvador and Guatemala, you can look into the United Nations Rights Watch. You can look into Amnesty International, and there's others. If you Google them, Google how brutal these killings were. They weren't just, citizens protesting being shot. They were people who were raped, mutilated, and tortured before they were killed. There's a few particularly grotesque ones. I won't go into them here because it hurts my brain to even think about it. But yes, in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas were not going to go with the United States government's policy. So instead, the United States decided to try to overthrow them through the Contras, who were supported through the Reagan administration selling weapons to Iran. The Iran-Contra affair, which is very famous, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But that is something that I cannot emphasize enough. The United Nations, the international body in which the United States helped form and has been an impartial body of voicing its concerns against human rights violations, condemned and found the Reagan administration guilty of acts of aggression toward Nicaragua, and said they need to pay reparations. The United States government, being they, need to pay reparations for Nicaragua, which has not happened since then and will not happen because we don't pay for the bad things that we do. We'll never pay, for instance, for the brutal regimes of El Salvador and Guatemala that we willfully supported. If I forget to mention it at any point while I'm talking over the next brief period, remember all of this is happening under the Reagan administration. Just to be clear, there will be bits and pieces where I may let you know that this blended more into George H.W. Bush's administration, but still. Speaking of the Iran-Contra affair, this is where we're going to get into drug trafficking, arms for hostages, that sort of thing. The Iran-Contra affair was a cluster of a lot of different things from about 1981 to 1986. The Reagan administration secretly facilitated the sale of arms to Iran from that time period as mentioned. Iran was supposed to be under an embargo that we led the case for, the Reagan administration championed, and which we were not supposed to do this for. So, when it became public that this happened, there was obviously outrage. But much like the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, which we'll be discussing Indochina next week, the Reagan administration found a scapegoat. Oliver North took the full blame and was indicted, told Congress it was all him, but the facts and the evidence show that everyone in the Reagan administration knew that this was happening, that this was something that was going on. It, of course, also plays into arms for hostages. You probably heard the reports. There's enough evidence to support it that the Reagan administration had contact with the Iranians who were keeping hostages during the Carter administration, and that they undermined those negotiations so that Reagan could use it for political power whenever he came into office in the 80s, which he did by giving Iranians weapons. Now, it's time we're going to talk about the Iranian-Contra affair as it pertains to drug trafficking. Some of this is going to get close to conspiracy theory. It is my personal belief that there is enough facts and evidence of what I'm getting ready to talk about that it is enough to prove. However, before I say that, I should let you know that 3 separate federal investigations into CIA drug trafficking found that the CIA did not willfully distribute crack cocaine or any other drug into the American ghettos that are populated mostly by African Americans. Those reports did find that the CIA knew about the distribution of drugs into the ghettos by individuals from the Contras. We'll talk about one in a minute. And did nothing about it or encouraged it, just to be clear. Now, that out of the way, if you go to pbs.com or if you look on YouTube, you can type in Frontline, May 17th, 1988, cocaine in the United States military. You will find a 58-minute interview with footage of an American soldier talking about bringing drugs into the United States from Nicaragua distributed to him by the Contras. This man talks about landing in Florida or other places with pounds of marijuana is what he mentions primarily in the footage. Cocaine is also mentioned. And then giving it off to someone, and after that, he has no idea what happened to it. This is an American military personnel bringing drugs under direct order from the United States government. To be clear, anything the CIA does, anything the FBI does, anything the TSA does, they do it under the explicit order of the United States government. They're not separate entities. There is never once, I can't say never once because I'm sure there's been like a rogue agent who sent an email when he wasn't supposed to, or the Russian spy scandal, whatever. But the higher-ups of the CIA, its director, the FBI director, the TSA director, all get their orders from Washington, from that administration. Nothing that goes on there happens without the explicit okay of that presidential administration. So the Reagan administration willfully knew that their military, their secret service of whatever, was bringing in drugs to the country, giving it to someone, and then those drugs went, evidence shows, to African American ghettos throughout the United States. Now, with that point being made clear, we get to talk about Freeway Rick Ross, not the rapper, a major cocaine dealer. He is famous for being a very successful drug dealer until he was caught on a third strike penalty. He was sentenced to life and then got out later. after a journalist in San Jose Mercury News, you probably know who it is. I'm not going to mention him. It's all muddy. I'm not getting to the conspiracy theory. But one of Ross's cocaine sources, his primary cocaine source, was a man whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce. I got Danilo. I think that's about as close as we're going to get. And he was a man who had been given cocaine through the Contras, through make your own inferences, and had been Ross's primary source of getting cocaine. It's been said a million times. Where do you think the cocaine came through? Where could it possibly come through? This isn't a Frank Lucas situation where he claimed that the heroin comes from in Vietnam, where they were transporting it on dead soldiers' caskets, something that's been disproved, by the way. This is soldier brings drugs from Nicaragua to Florida. Soldier hands off those drugs. Somehow, in between there, those drugs get to someone who can then distribute them to Rick Ross in California. Once again, that is just a basic fact. All of those are things that you can come up with your own judgments. I'm not going to say it one way or the other. Like I said, 3 federal investigations. It's not like the United States government would ever lie to us about anything. But with the war on drugs, with these drugs being brought into the African American ghettos, you have this destabilization of the African American community, other minority communities, poor whites included, who are now being put off into privatized prisons to work for free. This last part of the video, we're going to talk about the Cold War. The Reagan administration very publicly started the training of the people who would later become Al-Qaeda and other radical jihadists in Afghanistan to fight the USSR. That's something we've seen time and time again. Proxy wars are how the United States drains its enemy. Something I would like to personally talk about that is not discussed a whole lot is the Reagan administration almost willfully started World War III. The year escapes me, but sometime within the early 80s, the Reagan administration conducted a flight test over USSR airspace to see what their reaction would be. I am not joking. That's from Who Rules the World by Chomsky. It's in that book. It's probably been documented other places. But yeah, the president of the United States, his administration, just to see what would happen, conducted an air test over their number one enemy in the world, who every single minute of every day Americans had been told could end the world with their nuclear rockets. That's the type of stuff that they were doing at that point, just for fun. Because next week's video is going to be talking about Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, I did not talk about this as much this video, but the Reagan administration supported Pol Pot throughout their entire time, when Pol Pot was at his most dangerous and doing his most killings. That should be noted as of right now. Recap, the Reagan administration introduced destabilizing the South America region. He supported brutal regimes in Guatemala and in El Salvador, and then was condemned by the International Court of Justice in order to pay reparations to Nicaragua for what was called acts of unwarranted aggression. The Reagan administration used Iran-Contras as a way to make money to try to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, while also somehow drugs were being taken from the Contras through United States military personnel to Florida, where I guess they just got lost, and then someone who was a known affiliate of the CIA was distributing them in LA and other poor African American places. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you for watching this video. My Tetris score is now at 336,000. If you can beat that, please let me know. Next week, we're going to talk about Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and the United States involvement there. So thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you next week. Bye.